In this video, you will witness wild reactions to court verdicts, ranging from maniacal laughter to attempts to confront the judge with bare hands. After all, a guilty verdict is an emotional event, and criminals are not the most stable individuals. And at the end, we'll even show you a defendant who literally threw excrement at the fan. Watch until the end. TJ Lane. A case of blatant mockery and a rather disgusting reaction to a guilty verdict was demonstrated by TJ Lane, a cold-blooded killer who carried out a shooting at a school, killing 3 teenagers and injuring several others. Naturally, he received a life sentence, but using a marker, the guy had crafted himself a t-shirt with the proud label "Killer." He showed up at the court hearing, and during the announcement of the verdict, he took the opportunity to turn and face the relatives of his victims, showing them his middle finger. Why such mockery of the victims was allowed in court and why they didn't make him change his t-shirt is unclear. Furthermore, TJ Lane escaped from prison just a year later, along with 2 other inmates, but fortunately they managed to apprehend him before he could commit more crimes, as there was no sign of remorse from him. Does this behavior surprise you? But this is just the tip of the iceberg compared to the other individuals on our list. Brian Nichols. This is one of the most tragic stories on our list. Brian Nichols was on trial for breaking into his ex-girlfriend's home, assaulting her, duct-taping her mouth shut, and subjecting her to 3 days of sexual assault before finally releasing her. During the court hearings, Nichols behaved provocatively. The day before, the judge and prosecution demanded increased security measures. Homemade shanks were found in the defendant's shoes in his prison cell. However, Cynthia Hall, following instructions, did not handcuff the defendant during the trial and the verdict announcement. According to state laws, defendants are not allowed to appear in handcuffs in the courtroom to avoid creating a negative psychological effect on the jury and ensuring their objectivity. Nichols took advantage of this. He snatched a gun from the deputy sheriff's holster and shot her in the head. Miraculously, the woman survived. Nichols overpowered the bailiffs, ran into the hallway, and then headed to the 8th floor of the building where Judge Roland Barnes was presiding over another trial. Entering the courtroom, Nichols shot the judge first and then a court reporter. Both died on the spot. Afterward, the killer left the building. Nichols was confronted by another deputy sheriff outside, and the criminal killed him too. In the end, the story resulted in 7 more deaths and the killer's suicide in church. But in the United States, it finally became clear that judges were practically defenseless against inmates due to overly humane and lenient laws. What room is there for remorse in such cases? Even a death sentence sometimes evokes strange emotions, as in the case of the next person on our list. Louis Bracamontes. When Louis Bracamontes was found guilty of the murder of 2 police officers, he looked very pleased and even joyful. The jury recommended the death penalty. He made headlines due to his inappropriate behavior in the courtroom. When his crimes were being discussed, he laughed, and then, in fits of anger, requested to be executed, claiming he did everything right and had no regrets. Essentially, he said, "Let's finish this here and now. What else can you do to me?" Only occasionally can you find a glimmer of humanity in the eyes of dangerous criminals. Trey Relford. This is one of the most unusual cases on our list. Trey and his accomplices robbed and killed a young pizza delivery man who was supposed to return home from his last delivery. The police couldn't catch Trey for over 2 years, but he was eventually turned in by his own accomplices. The victim's family also attended the trial. Everyone in the courtroom listened with bated breath as the father addressed his son's killer. "I'm not angry with you," he told Relford. "I blame the devil who led you and the others astray to commit such a heinous crime." Afterward, Relford broke down in tears and sincerely embraced the man, apologizing for his actions. Instead of a life sentence, the court sentenced him to only 31 years in prison. It's a sad and touching story. Unfortunately, such emotions are rare. More often, there is wild rage and hatred toward all living beings, as in the case that follows. Sandell Jackson. Sandell Jackson was never a saint. He was a member of criminal gangs who lived in constant turmoil and robberies. When he learned that he would spend his life in prison for the murder of Nathan Porter, he flew into a rage. He started behaving wildly, cursing the victim's family and the judge. He overturned a table and attempted to rush forward to explain that he was wrongly convicted and he was a perfectly respectable member of society. Court bailiffs had to use pepper spray to calm him down. and then 3 of them had to physically restrain him and remove him from the courtroom. On top of such behavior, additional charges were added to his sentence. Naturally, there was no sign of remorse here. Dexter Johnson. Dexter Johnson was sentenced to death in 2007. At the age of 19, Johnson had already built a substantial criminal career, but the final straw was the murder and brutal rape of Maria Upper-Reyes, as well as gang-related attack with accomplices that resulted in the death of 2 more individuals who were deemed expendable after the robbery. Upon hearing the verdict, Johnson threw a chair and attempted to attack everyone around him. Court bailiffs had to physically subdue him. People in the courtroom were in a panic. Someone even lost consciousness and had to be taken away by an ambulance. But the bravery of this hero didn't last long. After realizing his sentence, Johnson began feigning intellectual disability, causing his execution to be postponed until 2019 because the courts were obligated to consider all appeals, even if it was an obvious spectacle. But it's not only men who behave wildly and aggressively. Here is an example of inappropriate behavior by a female defendant. Diana Lavdjoy. Diana Lavdjoy hired her firearms instructor to kill her husband, with whom she was going through a divorce. The reason for such cruelty was disputes over custody of their child. She didn't want to share custody and pay her husband $120,000 as a settlement for his share of their property. It was cheaper to hire a hitman, especially one she knew. Fortunately, the crime failed. The instructor turned out to be an amateur capable only of shooting at paper targets, and her husband survived a gunshot wound. Both criminals received life sentences. During the sentencing, Diana Lavdjoy lost consciousness because she had expected people to sympathize with her. She just wanted to raise her child. Relatives in the courtroom were crying and asking for help, shocked by such injustice. The judge, however, was more rational, asking to clear the room so that medical professionals could provide assistance to those overly sensitive to the situation. He then handed down the sentence in accordance with the full extent of the law. And here is another pair of women who believed that a child's life wasn't worth the punishment. Erika May Butts. Erika May Butts and Shanita Latrice Cunningham stood before the court for the murder of a 3-year-old child under their care as babysitters. Cunningham pleaded guilty while Butts insisted on her innocence but agreed that there were substantial pieces of evidence on the prosecution's side. That is what's known as an Relford plea in legal slang. Apparently, these two expected some leniency for acknowledging the existence of evidence rather than genuine remorse. However, it's clear they didn't receive it, and both were sentenced to life in prison. When the judge read the verdict, Butts had a nervous breakdown. She started screaming, collapsed, and began to hyperventilate. Cunningham simply lost consciousness and had to be taken out of the courtroom in a chair. It's quite an unexpected reaction to a verdict that seemed obvious to any reasonable person except this pair. Larry Nassar. But sometimes aggression is not only displayed by the criminals themselves, because a court proceeding is a highly emotional event for all participants, especially for the victim's loved ones. A similar incident occurred in a highly publicized trial. In 2018, former doctor for the USA gymnastics team Larry Nassar was sentenced to 175 years in prison for sexual abuse and misconduct involving underage athletes. The father of one of the girls couldn't contain himself and, while shoving bailiffs, tried to attack the defendant by leaping over the table. Honestly, the defendant invoked disgusting feelings not only in the victims but also in the judge, who referred to him as a monster and expressed hope that he rots in prison. Larry tried to appeal the verdict and complained that he was being unfairly treated. Fortunately, his appeal was denied. Deshian Brown. A similar incident occurred in a Cincinnati courtroom when a father attacked the defendant accused of killing his son, attempting to carry out his own version of the sentence. However, court bailiffs reacted promptly and managed to stop him. Antonio Hughes rushed at the defendant, Deshian Brown, and managed to strike him several times. Officers were able to subdue Hughes by wrestling him to the ground, but he attacked again as soon as he managed to get up. It's a sad situation, but the father was charged with contempt of court and received an additional 7 days of imprisonment. Hughes was the father of 3-year-old Nilo Latimore. The defendant, Deshian Brown, murdered Nilo's mother, Natasha, with whom he was in a relationship, and threw the child into the Ohio River while he was still alive. The child's body was never found, so the father's emotions can be understood, but the law is the law. Danta Wright. During murder trials, the relatives and the loved ones of the victims often read their statements, expressing their feelings and emotions. It's a normal practice, although sometimes overly emotional. Danta Wright killed 18-year-old Jordan Cleary. When the victim's family was reading their statement, the murderer smiled and struggled to contain his laughter. Afterward, he addressed the court telling his own family that he would be home soon, unlike his victims. A good joke? He was extremely surprised when he received a life sentence, showing his bewilderment along with his accomplice during the announcement. But confusion is one thing, and the next criminal on our list decided to lash out at the bailiffs. Adrian Dunn. Adrian Dunn shot and killed Rakim Charles during a drug deal that didn't go as planned. The prosecutor's office pointed out during the trial that Dunn was a hardened criminal, that he had multiple priors, and that his chances of re-offending based on his record were very high, making him a danger to society. The judge agreed and sentenced Dunn to life in prison. For his part, Dunn proved the court right when he began to fight with 5 bailiffs who tried to restrain him, because he considered the sentence unjust and himself almost a model of crystal reputation. Manson Bryant. In 2018, professional criminal Manson Bryant was convicted of robbery, kidnapping, and armed robbery. He was a true mobster in every sense of the word. Before the sentence was handed down, he delivered an emotional speech about how many wrong decisions he had made in his life, how drugs were involved, and how he was trying to change. He implored understanding and forgiveness. He insisted that the judge was fair and that he would surely be given a chance for a new life, since he had chosen to repent in court. Manson praised the entire justice system and continually thanked the court for the decision, which no one else had voiced. But when the judge announced a 22-year sentence, Bryant's mood instantly changed. He flew into a rage, began cursing the court, called the judge a racist, and used profanity extensively. As a result, he received an additional 6 years for contempt of court, even though he had been so close to repentance. Oh, that judge. Now let's talk about a terrorist who was proud of himself, and Harvard University had to apologize for it later. Ted Kaczynski. Theodore Kaczynski, a Harvard-educated mathematician, secluded himself in a dirty cabin in the Montana wilderness and led a 17-year bombing campaign that resulted in the deaths of 3 people and injuries to 23 others. He received 8 life sentences for a series of bombings by mailing explosive devices. However, Ted considered this a reward for his work and listed each sentence as an award from the Harvard Alumni Association on the eve of the 50th reunion of his class. Later, the Alumni Association had to apologize for the publication of this list along with the criminal's comments. Now, the next case involves boundless cynicism and impunity, unfortunately something that occasionally happens in our society. Zarac McCoy. At the moment of receiving a life sentence, the convicted often experience anger and nothing more, as they have nothing to lose. Zarac McCoy was convicted of an armed attack on a couple. He fired 16 shots, but apparently not accurately enough, as both victims survived. He was tried for causing grievous bodily harm, but found not guilty of attempted murder. The judge said he had no choice as there was insufficient evidence and intent for a murder charge. Given the number of shots, he would have killed if he wanted to. So what did McCoy do in appreciation of such a lenient sentence? Before being escorted out of the courtroom, he told the judge, "Suck it, jerk." The guy remained unpunished. Ricky Hand. Ricky Hand was convicted of a series of armed robberies. He showed up at his last hearing with a bandaged hand, and everyone assumed it was due to an injury he had sustained. Astonishingly, the bailiffs didn't even search the criminal for any particular heavy charges. Upon hearing the sentence, Hand exclaimed in dissatisfaction, "Did you just give me 40 years?" Then, to the complete surprise of everyone in the courtroom, he reached into his bandage and threw a handful of feces, which he had concealed in a bottle, at his own attorney. Afterward, he was subdued and removed from the courtroom with a smug grin. The contents of the bottle were a clear evaluation of the courtroom security's performance. Unfortunately, many criminals don't even realize the gravity of their actions, and such people are impossible to rehabilitate through a prison sentence. But there's nothing more to be done. Thank you for watching.